Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next edition of Amplified Race and Reality in STEM. My name is Dr. Manu Platt, and I'm happy to see you all again here today. Amplified Race and Reality in STEM aims to give a national platform to speakers to have candid conversations about race and diversity in STEM fields. It was launched this year as a part of Gladstone's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this series is hosted in partnership with Georgia Tech, my current institution, the Molecular Engineering and Sciences Institute at University of Washington, and the University of Texas at Austin. We hope these discussions spark change throughout the sciences. And this event is currently being live streamed on Facebook and is also being recorded. The recording will be available after the event on Gladstone's YouTube channel. For those interested in Q&A, which we'd love to have our viewers participate, you can submit questions anytime during the talk by using the Q&A button. If you're watching on Facebook Live, submit your questions in the chat, and our moderator will share them with me and the speaker. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can after the presentation. For those on social media, please amplify and spread the word and follow the conversation using the hashtag #AmplifiedSTEM. Coming up next in our series, save for this one, of course, but join us for next in March 30th, where we have Skylar Walks presenting The Root of It, Decolonizing Curriculum and Organizational Practices in STEM, which can be, you can register at gladstone.org to be sure you're there for that one. But now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker. You see I'm rocking my Spelman College shirt today. It's a little small, but that's fine. Because our speaker, Dr. Aziza A. Belcher Platt, is an alumnus of Spelman College, graduating in 2001 with a degree in computer science. And after she graduated from Spelman College, she went on to work at Goldman Sachs doing IT. Doesn't seem like it fits the talk. Doing IT there for 8 years before realizing that her purpose was really to reach out, help people. And so she went back to graduate school, left the corporate life, and earned her degree in her PhD in counseling psychology from Fordham University. Then after completing a postdoc recently, she's now started her own practice, Aziza Belcher LLC, and she's been involved in the struggle and has been doing numerous talks in her psychological world. And I asked her when I've heard some of those topics, you should actually bring that to the Amplified series. So to cut it short, I now am happy to turn this over to Dr. Aziza Belcher Platt.
Thank you, the other Dr. Platt, the first Dr. Platt. I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So you know a little bit about who I am and why I'm here. How do we apply psychology to create equity in STEM? So thank you, Manu, for recommending me for this talk and for Gladstone Institutes and the entire committee behind this Amplified series for all of the effort in coordinating it and for hosting me, and to everyone who's listening for attending this webinar and attending to the issues in STEM. So who am I? I am an African-American cisgender woman. I'm able-bodied, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my identities and why I'm telling you that a little bit later on. I'm a licensed counseling psychologist, and I'm based here in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a practitioner, I'm a scientist, and I'm a consultant. So today, my goal is for us to come out of this understanding the impact of systemic inequality at social and societal levels, to apply some tools to assess racial cultural identities and intersections and experiences, to sort of recognize when race is a factor in interpersonal interactions and really discuss some of these biases that influence and derail communication and cooperation, and for us to figure out how to have and facilitate intercultural dialogue that affects change at the group level and at the systemic level. So one thing that's really important to know is that language shapes the way we think, experience the world, and understand our society. So vague or unclear language, like cliches or jargon or lies or reckless language, that obscures the issue, the responsibility, the consequences. And it's really important when we're thinking and talking about race to be clear, to be direct, and to name the systems, the actors, the behaviors, the impacts, and the remedies. So you won't hear me say things like racially tinged or racially charged. I'm going to say racist or racism. So in order for us to talk about racism, we have to talk about what's at the root of it, which is white supremacy. And I know that you've heard this, but white supremacy is at the system level. It's interpersonal, it's institutional, it's cultural, it's systemic. And it affects all these different domains that you see listed here. And then within it, there are two sides of the same coin. There's racism, which we know a lot about, right? Prejudice, hatred, discrimination. And then there is the privilege side of it. So, or it's white privilege or white skin privilege. And so some people get the benefit and the other people get the oppression. I love this diagram because it really sort of captures that there's some things that we see about racism above the surface, but there are a lot of things that are part of white supremacy and racism that really sort of go uncalled out, unnoticed. And it's important for us to not allow that to continue to be the case. So there's a spoken word artist who says in this poem, white supremacy is not a shark. So it's not that it can't be the sharks, but white supremacy is the water, and we are surrounded by it. We are immersed in it, and we are drowning in it. And the sooner we accept that, the more we can do to actually change the system. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of racism. One of the syndromes sort of that captures a little bit of it is race-based traumatic stress. So this is individual and systemic racism. This is what happens to me in my daily life as I go about and interact with other people or the systems that I have to interact with in order to get my job or my life done. And then there are direct traumatic stressors. So these are the things that we see when people, for instance, are calling the police on you for being exactly where you should be, or questioning whether or not you should be there, or you being pulled over, or you being brutalized. The vicarious traumatic stressors are the things every time we see a video of someone else having the police called on them for being exactly where they need to be, or being brutalized, or being killed, or any of that. That's what a vicarious traumatic stressor is. And the transmitted stressors are intergenerational. This is decades and centuries of the racism that people have experienced, the oppression they've experienced, and the ways in which it passes down throughout the generations. So the symptoms when we experience racism, it can be a little bit of everything: anger, anxiety, apathy, low self-esteem, mood changes. And a lot of times the symptoms are PTSD-like. People are hypervigilant, they're avoidant, they have intrusive recurring thoughts, playing back things that were said and done to them. And they begin to have a negative self-perception. And it goes beyond that, right? There are physical reactions: headaches, chest pain, sleep and appetite difficulties, high blood pressure, all of the things that you get when you have chronic stress. And a particular sort of brand or a type of manifestation of racism is microaggressions. So Dr. Su and his colleagues created this taxonomy. So I just put it here. I'm sure you've probably already seen it. It talks about the different types of micro insults and assaults and invalidations that say to people in subtle ways, you don't belong here, you're not worthy, you should be subservient to me, you are criminal, whatever it might be. So I want to share with you that in addition to what I just talked about with race-based traumatic stress, microaggressions have this cumulative impact day in and day out. If you've ever seen that video, I'm not going to play it today, but it talks about microaggressions like a mosquito bite. And so if you can imagine, you might commit one microaggression against somebody, but you're probably the 1 millionth microaggression they've had to deal with that day. From the moment you leave your home to the moment you get where you're going, how many people have said or done something that made you feel like you weren't worthy, you're less than, you shouldn't be where you are? So daily life, it has an impact on our mental health and our physical health across the lifespan. So children and adolescents also experience microaggressions, and you can see it creates embarrassment and this fear of stereotype confirmation concern, and they begin to believe that they can't do as well as other people, and they feel invisible and undervalued and treated differently. We see it all across the college campus in terms of student self-esteem, their emotions, and oftentimes they feel depleted in their resources. I don't have the wherewithal to do what I'm here to do and to fight this racism. On the campus, it affects their sense of belonging at the university and their sense of self. Oftentimes, students report being portrayed either as predators, cheaters, thieves, threats, interlopers, and in some cases, subhuman. So people feel invisible and hypervisible at the same time, and we see that they feel hopeless and helpless. And even in residential halls, we all know that wherever you're living is supposed to be your safe space. We see that students feel uncomfortable because of microaggressions, and when they seek help, they're invalidated by the administration, and they feel unwelcomed and unsupported by the campus community. This is true throughout the training process: graduate students, trainees, supervisees, and faculty. And faculty is interesting because they experience micro invalidations by their white colleagues and micro insults by white students. So if you can imagine, you get it both ways, coming and going. So racism affects us differently, but it does hurt us all. And this is one of the things I really want to stress today. Culturally, emotionally, morally, relationally, socially, and in terms of our intersections, we are all being suffocated by racism and white supremacy. So one of the things that it costs us, which we'll never know how much, right, is that the qualifications of BBIPOC, and I know I didn't define that earlier, so in case you're not familiar, it means Black, Brown, Indigenous, and People of Color. The contributions of BBIPOC are constantly rejected and downplayed and co-opted and what have you. And so for BBIPOC, that places a question mark in the history books for their missed opportunities. Can you ever really know how much you were denied because the system was built unfairly? Well, it doesn't just hurt them though. For white identified people, it places an asterisk in the history books for their accomplishments. Can you ever really know how much you truly earned because the system was built unfairly? And so, what I got in my research is that if you could imagine going through all of that, experiencing racism and microaggressions, and then you come to group therapy and you get more of the same system of privilege and social dominance, of people being colorblind or not addressing race and racism, of there being interpersonal racism and marginalization. And it's the same thing over and over again. But there were some participants in my study who had a different experience. And this is what I'm saying is possible, not just in group therapy, but in your work groups. We can co-create a dynamic of racial justice. We can have awareness and cultural pluralism. There's room for all of us and for all of us to be our full selves. We can meaningfully involve people of color as opposed to marginalize them. We can have restorative intergroup engagement. And equitable interethnic engagement. And we can actually form coalitions as opposed to BBIPOC being pitted against each other. So you might think, okay, are we hardwired to be racist? We are not. You may have heard about the reptilian brain, that limbic lobe. So what it is it uses sensory information to detect and respond to perceived danger. And it's pretty quick and it's sort of instinctual. And so without our higher functioning, sometimes we do respond to things just based off of very quick, snap, limited judgments. We do have a natural in-group preference, right? We like and are drawn to people who are like us. That doesn't mean that we can't develop an out-group preference. What we have to do is have meaningful intergroup contact. The other thing we do is we use heuristics, which is shortcuts that we use in our brain to categorize and generalize information just to cope with all of what's coming at us in our environment. And so sometimes we get a little lazy or we have shortcuts that aren't serving us well. So one of those types of shortcuts are cognitive biases, right? These are shortcuts that we use to make judgments about people and situations. What we know for sure in psychology is that they play a role in unequal outcomes for BBIPOC. So one example is moral licensing. Due to confidence from past moral behavior, people are more likely to engage in immoral or unethical ways. So they've hired one person of color and they sort of feel like, okay, well, check it off. I don't have to do anything else about that diversity. Or an affinity bias. Remember, I said we have a preference for our in-group. So getting along with and evaluating people who are like you more positively. And we see this a lot when people of color are rejected as lacking the culture fit. Confirmation bias. So this is seeking the info to confirm what you already believe and ignoring new info, right? So using stereotypes about certain groups of color when selecting leadership positions. These people aren't natural leaders or these people can't do the job, whatever that might be. And of course, we see that people use logical fallacies. So I want to show you a couple of them. So one is like the straw man and the false dilemma, right? We see this all the time with Black Lives Matter. So it misrepresents an argument so it becomes easier to attack. And so in response to Black Lives Matter, which is not saying all lives don't matter, right? Just that Black lives are the ones most in danger, we see people shout all lives matter. Okay, well, that's changing it, right? And it's also not true because we see based off of the way people are treated that all lives don't matter. Or the red herring, arguing for an irrelevant topic with the intention of distracting. So when we're raising our voices about Black Lives Matter and trying to move things forward in our country, and then people say, well, what about those who looted? Who's talking about looting except you, right? The topic at hand is Black Lives Matter, but this is one of the logical fallacies that we struggle with. This one is called Personal Incredulity. I love this cartoon. You'll see what happens here. A person of color says, hey, this thing happened to me. And somebody says, it's never happened to me. I don't think it happens. I'm telling you it does. And other people of color will say, I've had a similar experience. It definitely happens. And the end result is, it's never happened to me, so I don't think it happens. And we have to disabuse ourselves of that as well. We have to believe people. So, one logical fallacy is individualistic racism. So, we all know what happened at the Capitol last week, and it would be easy to look at any of these faces and to see any of that video and think, those people over there are racist. Look at them. They're extremists. They're conspiracy theorists. They're on the fringe. And that is true. There were some conspiracy theorists and extremists and fringe people there. But I'd like to introduce you to some of the people you might live next door to. We have CEOs of tech companies, and a person who owns a florist, and the son of a judge, and an occupational therapist at a school. Another logical fallacy is this legalistic thing about racism. Well, if we just change the laws, racism will go away. Well, I'd like to introduce you to at least 6 of the lawmakers who participated in the sedition at the Capitol last week. So again, we have to get ourselves out of this mindset that it's going to be a law change that's going to make a difference. I'm not saying policy doesn't matter, but we have to change ourselves. So being shocked at what happened last week is not allyship. And you have to stop saying, this isn't America. This is America as we have always known it. So I love Shel Silverstein, and I always remembered this poem. If we had hinges on our heads, there wouldn't be no sin, because we could take the bad stuff out and leave the good stuff in. And it would be so nice if we can do that, but we can't. That said, we do have our brains, and psychology can help us to do some things better and differently. We can create new neural pathways and lose those that we stop using. We can reframe our approach and develop our underutilized brain functions. And we can embrace a growth mindset and take on the new challenges and skills and ongoing learning and development of interacting with people who are different from us in really meaningful ways. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the barriers around what people think happens when we talk about race and racism. So you've probably heard, if we stop talking about race, racism will go away. And I love this picture. Telling me that I'm obsessed with talking about racism in America is like telling me I'm obsessed with swimming when I'm drowning. Race and racism are different things. Race is always present, even if we don't acknowledge it. Race is rich, it's full of dimensions, it has great magnitude and weight and significance on our lives. Racism, even if we don't acknowledge it, is a reality. By avoiding addressing and acknowledging racism, we miss out on the richness and the dimensions of race, and we make race the problem. So I'd like to, invite you just silently to think of a race or a culture different than your own. And without using food, music, or attire, describe some of the dimensions of that community of people. And because we're doing this quietly, you can continue this activity. I'm going to keep us moving. So some of the things that you maybe couldn't think about were, what's the history of that group of people? How are their families structured? What are their birth and death rituals? What are the oppressions, past and present, that they have dealt with and are dealing with? So again, back to the iceberg, you can see there's some things about race and culture that are above the waterline. We easily see those, we indulge in those, in some ways we enjoy those things. But there's so much more about us, our race and our culture, that we really don't get to because we decide we have to toss race out in order to avoid racism, and that's not the way it works. So what do we do? Dr. Love says we can develop a liberatory consciousness. It means that we're going to live with awareness and intention. And I'm going to go over these 4 steps, but I wanted to put this quote here because what I love is it says, this is daily, and it is to be continually practiced event by event each time we are faced with a situation in which oppression or internalized oppression is evident. And this reminds us that every human can acquire the skill to become a liberation worker. So the steps for liberatory consciousness. So first, we want to develop our awareness. We got to notice what's happening. And then analysis. We have to analyze what's happening from a stance of awareness along with the possibilities of action. So not just I'm going to notice it and think about what's happening, but I'm thinking about it toward acting. And then deciding on the basis of that analysis what needs to be done and seeing to it that the action is accomplished. That last part is really important. We have to see this through. And then accountability and allyship. Accept accountability to yourself and to whatever community you belong to for the consequences of the actions that you take or don't take. And this is an ongoing process. So one of the first parts of that, we get this from multicultural psychology, is that we know that every human being has a development of their racial cultural identity. And so you can see, I put some of the more popular models here. They all start out in a place of we're all immersed in this system and we're trying to figure out and become immersed in our own culture. And so the trajectories are a little different, but let me break down what's important. In the early stages of racial identity development, what you have is internalized racism, assimilation, alienation, marginalization. We are paralyzed by self-hatred, guilt, shame, and defensiveness. But in the later stages, if we can allow ourselves and push ourselves to mature through toward the end of our racial identity development, we can have social political consciousness, we can accept ourselves and our own culture and have a pluralistic perspective about other cultures. We can all acknowledge white supremacy and racism and privilege and increase our sense of responsibility in dismantling it. So hopefully what you get is that I'm encouraging you to do what it takes to move yourself to the later stages of your racial identity development. The other thing we have to do is become aware of our power and privilege. So I mentioned privilege earlier. So I love this wheel, and as you can see, power is in the center. So everything closest to it has a lot of power and privilege. And while I'm talking, I'm going to locate myself for you, and I want you to think about locating yourself as well. So I'm a citizen, so I'm pretty close to the power in that way. I'm a native English speaker, so also that way. I'm heterosexual and I'm able-bodied. Now, outside of that, I start to get into the outer realms. I get further away from the power. Here, I'm of a large body size, so I'm all the way out in the marginalized area. I definitely wouldn't call myself rich, so I can't call myself poor, but I'm in the middle there. But I'm a cisgender woman, so you can see I'm in the second band. This is important because I think it really illustrates for us where if you're close to the power in any place, it's your job to use that power and that privilege in the service of the people who are in those second and third rungs. So my question, and again, it's rhetorical because I know that we're sort of moving along. Do you think you hold privilege? If so, how much? I saw this quote and I've held on to it. If you've never had the Supreme Court decide if you have the same rights as others, you have privilege. So if you aren't anywhere near that power wheel, this is a great barometer for do you have privilege? I love this racism scale because, again, going back to those photos of the rioters at the Capitol, right? We can all look and say, well, those people who do certain things, they're racist, right? But this shows us that it's more of a continuum. So maybe you wouldn't inflict fear upon a Black person on purpose. But as you see, we move to the middle, you think, well, that has nothing to do with me. And so you're more of an indifferent, apathetic sort of place. Or you start to get defensive and you ask questions like Black on Black crime, which we know is not that much higher than other people and their crime. Or you ask about what is reverse racism, right? We're in that justification place. Or maybe you're in the denial. Racism no longer exists. You think we're in a post-racial society. Slavery ended so many years ago. When we have those sorts of beliefs, then we have these types of behaviors where we're either in a white savior place or we're in this woke justification place. You know, the only race is the human race. And I would say, because people say all the time, race is a social construct. Yes, and we live in a social world. So until that construct, until the world changes, we can't just say we're going to throw out the construct. We can get into performative allyship, where you do things to get clout, or you do things to check the box, or to be publicly seen as being progressive, and so that you can get praise and publicity. Where we want to be is over here in this allyship abolitionist level, where we are making space for people of color. We acknowledge systemic racism is real and needs to be ended. And you are willing to put your safety, your health, your freedom on the line to fight for people of color. So people say all the time, I already use my privilege for others. Okay, great. If you could just think for a minute, how much do you have to lose? If you were pretty close to the power, you probably have a lot to lose. Even if you were on that second realm, you still have a lot to lose, but you're closer than other people. And so, of that power that you have to lose, how much of it have you lost? So, when you're thinking about whether or not you're using your privilege at all or enough, this is a good question to ask yourself. So, as we learn about ourselves, it's also really, really important that we learn about others and that we be careful about the ways in which we think about others. So, this characterization of barriers and systems, white supremacy is exhausting, white silence is exhausting, systemic racism exhausting, being Black is not exhausting. So, what we want to do is name the system of power as the barrier, not the identity. So, racism is the problem, not race. When we do this, remember I said starting with language, when you name the system, then you're really clear on what it is you're fighting and what you need to do. We also want to be careful about how we characterize these different communities. Yes, we are oppressed, but we also don't want to be talked about as though we're a deficit. So don't conflate Blackness with criminality. Like one of the things I hated during this election cycle, and it always comes up, is when people start talking to the Black community about what they're going to do for us, they start talking about reforming the criminal justice system. And the criminal justice system absolutely needs work. And that being said, Blackness and criminality are not the same thing. So if the only thing you know how to talk to me about when we're talking about Blackness is criminality, then there we have something that's happening in your head that you have to fix. That's a bias. The other thing is we want to be careful about the way we characterize our response, right? We've seen peaceful Black Lives Matter protests all summer long, and then you see people call it riot. Is it a riot or is it a rebellion? Is it an uprising? Are you talking about violence versus vandalism? Because those are different things. So you see this picture here says, you have stolen more than we could ever loot. Please don't ever talk to somebody about looting if you've not talked about people. We're talking about people's lives. So I wanted to give you some resources because you might be thinking, like, how do I learn all this stuff that you're saying I should know? These are some trainings and organizations. Jane Elliott, you may have seen some of her videos on YouTube. The People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, Confront White Womanhood, Showing Up for Racial Justice, and Movement for Black Lives. Last I checked, Yale University had these 2 open classes teaching on the Civil War and Reconstruction, and then From Emancipation to President. You can see the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones is also available. So tons of books, and I listed a few here. And I know a lot of people like white popular, and I'm not saying don't read that. Whatever your entree is into this sort of work and understanding, you take it. But I want you to really think about decolonizing your bookshelf. It's really important to read about race from scholars of color. There are tons of talks and toolkits out there. There are podcasts. What I love about podcasts is we're all busy people. And so it may feel like I don't have time to take a class or sit and read all of the books to know all the things. But podcasts are a way that you can integrate this into your daily life so that you can be learning as you go about your day. I wanted to share with you some of the people that, again, there are tons of people who do really great work, but some who you could follow. And the only caveat I want to give you is I watch these people every day on social media be microaggressed, be attacked, be harassed. And so I just want to encourage you that if you do decide to follow them in your interaction, however well-meaning, please don't perpetuate that same harm on them. And then there are some social media accounts that do really great work. And I've included some of their work because I want to show you what it is to follow these accounts and how also this is another way to integrate anti-racism into your daily life. So as you can see from this cartoon, that's a lot of work, but we've only really just been talking about recognizing it. So how do we get to the doing something about it? So this graphic was created last year, and it's really about how do you find your place in this liberation work? So Some of you, this is the STEM conference, maybe you're experimenters, maybe you're builders, maybe you're disruptors, maybe you're storytellers. Whatever it is, there is a place for everybody. And it's really about you finding your place and again, doing the work over and over again until the work is done. It's really important to create a culture for responding. So, what are the power dynamics? Because we see often it's really hard to bring up issues of race and culture in a setting when you feel like you're at risk. What's the setting and the context and people's sense of safety and their psychological resources? So, when it comes to addressing racism, I don't know if you've ever seen this narcissist prayer, but I feel like this is often, this captures what we get back a lot. That didn't happen. And if it did, it wasn't that bad. And if it was, that's not that big of a deal. And if it is, that's not my fault. And if it was, I didn't mean it. And if I did, you deserved it. So, for instance, I often have people say, I know that racism is bad, but I don't want to get political. So, again, I know that you're muted. And so I want you to say these things out loud to yourself as they come up on the screen. Would you also say, I know drinking and driving are bad, but I don't want to get political? I know domestic violence is bad, but I don't want to get political. I know child abuse is bad, but I don't want to get political. I know rape is bad, but I don't want to get political. I know conversion therapy is bad, ugh, but I don't want to get political. I know human trafficking is bad, but I don't want to get political. I know that slavery is bad, but I don't want to get political. So hopefully, as you heard yourself say it out loud or me say it out loud, you get what it is I'm trying to get us to say here. We say these things, we take a stance about all sorts of issues, regardless of what the politics are. But for some reason, we shy away from it when it comes to race. And I want us to really think about why we do that. So, another thing that people say to me often is, I would address the racist incident, but I don't want to make somebody feel shamed. Well, so again, when we talk about a liberatory consciousness, intention, and awareness, right? Someone has already been shamed, denigrated, embarrassed, hurt, whatever it is. By not addressing it, you are making a choice about who you prefer to feel this way. And by not taking action, you are making a choice that it stays this way for both parties. So oppression for BIPOC people and status quo for non-BIPOC people. The other thing about when we critique somebody or point out something and they feel fragile or defensive, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And that's the thing to remember when we're doing this work to bring anti-racism to our work groups and our organizations and our institutions. So another thing I hear often, it's important to hear both sides or to play devil's advocate. And the question, beautifully stated here, why is ending racism a debate? So you don't debate isms. When possible, you can correct them. And at times, at all times, you condemn them. So they call this debate club racism. Somebody's opinion is informed by their worldview, which is biased against you. They have something to gain from discrediting you. They've been taught their opinion is more important than your reality. Acknowledging racism requires that growth mindset that we talked about, and these people aren't ready to learn. Or people think it's a theoretical issue and not a real life human rights issue. And people believe that the intent of an action is more important than the impact. So one thing that we have from developmental psychology, Bronfenbrenner Brenner discovered or described this system to think about children and the world in which they develop. And so you have the chronos system, which is like time or history. And you have the macro system, which is societal beliefs and values. And then you have the exosystem, which is like all the economic, political, education, government, religious systems. And you have the mesosystem, which is really sort of the interaction between the exosystem and the microsystem, which is like the family, the school, the peers, the neighborhood, all of that. It is a brilliant theory, I think, but I use it a little bit differently when I'm talking about microaggressions and racial cultural events. So I'd like to show you. So you can see in this chrono system, this is from the 80s, right? Asian American people and children, this is how they were described, right? This is Time magazine. And you can see now we're in the midst of this COVID pandemic, and there's a model minority status that gets assigned to Asian people sometimes. But then you can see that something was branded and they were blamed for this virus. And so now we have both sides of this coin. And then from the highest level in the exosystem, you have the president calling it this virus by and linking it to a particular culture. And you have groups out in the world feeling like they've been attacked and they have to fight against it. And so in the microsystem, you can imagine this is what it's like to be walking around the world as an Asian person, and particularly in the United States, with the hostility. So I love that, because if you do it the way I just described it, then that helps you think about the context for other people. Sometimes people feel like, how in the world would I know that what I'm saying is a microaggression or it's offensive? The more you learn, the more you'll understand that framework. So you can see here, there's a long history of saying no Spanish or Mexicans. And you can see that society has this belief that they're constantly trying to cross our border and take from us. And then again, you have from the highest level, somebody denigrating an entire country of people. And then we saw what started to happen with ICE and the ways in which families were separated and even now are still caged in the midst of this pandemic. And so if you can imagine, what is it like to be a person of Mexican descent in this country during this time? So hopefully you get what I'm saying about why this is important and why this will help you not feel like the world is a landmine and you're constantly saying the wrong thing and stepping in the wrong place. The more you understand about other cultures, their oppressions, their history, then the more you understand what we're doing. So in my research, after talking to a lot of people who were in groups, I came up with this way to define how we respond to racial cultural events and microaggressions. So anti-therapeutic, and these are just like they sound, it's aggressive, it's defensive, it ranges from apathetic to antagonistic. Oftentimes it's somebody doubling down on something offensive that they've said. Non-therapeutic is passive, it's indirect, it's neutral or mostly neutral, but it's not helpful or useful. Really, it's the kind of thing where somebody says something, where they apologize, and then they flip it in a way that takes it back and sort of nullifies what they've said. And then there's therapeutic, which is assertive, it's direct, it's attentive, empathic, and meaningful. And I want to give you some examples. The other thing about responding to racial cultural events and microaggressions, my suggestion is to do it in the form of triage. So in a medical emergency, we treat the people with the severest injuries, we move to serious injuries, and we treat people with minor injuries. So in this case, I'm saying if somebody is the target of a microaggression and they're directly affected by it, that's the first person that you go to. Oftentimes we see people, if they respond at all, they go to the person who's the perpetrator, almost forgetting about the people who've been harmed. And then you want to go to the bystanders, people who are aware of or witness to the aggression, especially if they're people of color, because they're collateral damage in that. And then you want to work with the person who committed the microaggression. So putting it all together, you can see here we have this long-standing view of Mexican women, Latina women as Spitfire, right? And you can see the way they are portrayed in Hollywood. So this is sort of like representative of the societal beliefs and values. And then you can see in Congress, a Congressman Yoho calling Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez an effing B. And then this half sort of apology, I can't apologize for my passion and for loving my God, my family, and my country, right? So if that's what's happening in our governmental system, you can imagine what might be happening in somebody's everyday life. So here's an example. I spoke with a woman, her name is Yolanda, and she was simultaneously described as prickly and complimented as fiery by her white group members. So an anti-therapeutic response to that would be, isn't it a stereotype because it's true? Whereas a non-therapeutic response is, there's nothing wrong with being passionate, so you should take it as a compliment. So you can see the person with a non-therapeutic response is trying to make them feel better, but what they're doing is diminishing or dismissing what happened. Whereas a therapeutic response might be to say to the person who used those terms, I'm curious what you mean by that and what makes you use those words. Because one of the things that we want to start to do when we're having racial cultural dialogue, we do so much assuming that we want to illuminate what it is we're actually talking about. Tell me what you meant, because sometimes you didn't mean any harm, and there are just things you haven't said that would clarify what it is you're trying to say. Otherwise, we maybe need to address what made you think about me in that way. So another example, and my field of psychology is not at all exempt from racism. So you can see there's the science of eugenics. And then you have Wells Fargo CEO saying that there's a very limited pool of Black talent to recruit from. Now, I would tell you that I and every other Black person I know would not think this is true at all. We know tons of talented Black people. And then you can see what the employment rates have been and discrimination for the past 25 years. Black people have been the most discriminated against. So much so, NYC had to launch a campaign, right, to say working is a human right. And so, how do you respond to that sort of microaggression and that thought at your institution, at your group, at your company? Well, an anti therapeutic response is the most qualified person should get the job. Well, is that what happens though? Is it really a meritocracy? Or to say things like some Black people don't want to work. These are all things you recognize these as racist, as stereotypical, as wrong. Non therapeutic would be to say it's a good thing there's affirmative action. Because what that says to somebody is the only reason they've been hired is because of affirmative action. You are talented. So we want to say, and it's not that sometimes making diverse hires doesn't tick multiple boxes, but we never want to diminish that somebody's natural talent or their training or whatever qualifies them for that. Or to say something like, he's just one CEO. I'm sure there are a lot of companies that aren't like that. Again, this is an attempt to make somebody feel better, but it's dismissive and it's not true. There are lots of companies and CEOs that feel like that. So AOC actually had a great response, and I thought this was quite therapeutic. Perhaps it's the CEO of Wells Fargo who lacks the talent to recruit Black workers. So another example, we're all in the midst of this pandemic, COVID-19 hospitalization and death rates. I think we all know that people of color are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And you can see, kind of like what I was talking about earlier, because of the way this virus was branded here in the United States, the incidents against Asian people have gone up in terms of hate crimes, right? So there's a sentiment across the country. And you can see stimulus bill negotiations have gone on for who knows how long, right? For 10 months while people didn't have. And you can also see who's unemployed because of the pandemic. It's mostly people of color. So I think what you get before I reveal the next piece is that people of color are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And so when you have a system where, and this is a true story, the woman goes to her local city council and says that she is being discriminated against because she doesn't want to wear a mask. That right there is equivocation that is not true. So anti-therapeutic is one of those, well, to play devil's advocate, or discrimination is discrimination, there's no difference. There is a difference. Non-therapeutic is to say, I don't agree with her, but everyone's entitled to their opinion. Are they? Are you allowed to call this discrimination when other people are suffering? And then a therapeutic way of saying, I know you're frustrated and you feel like you're being treated unfairly, but what you're talking about isn't the same as discrimination because of race. So here you can say to somebody, I understand that whatever it is you're going through is difficult or feels difficult to you, and we're going to stay in the truth and use the right language around what we're saying. So I have to do this for myself. There is a long history in this country and others around Black women and their hair. The Army put out several years ago this poster of unauthorized hairstyles, and you might notice that it's a lot of Black women in here. So much so that New York State had to pass the Crown Act, and I think at least 9 states are part of it now, that says you cannot discriminate based off of people's hair. But if you go into a lot of stores, you will find that there is an ethnic hair care section because for some reason it needs to be segregated, and oftentimes it's locked up. And so this is something I've experienced a lot. The can I touch your hair? Anti-therapeutic, reaching out and touching somebody with or without their permission as if they are a pet, or commenting on people's on their hair as professional when it's straight and unprofessional when it's natural. Non-therapeutic, your hair looks so smooth that way. You should wear it that way more often. So there's a compliment, but there's also a judgment. Whereas therapeutic, you could say to somebody, I'm not quite sure you're aware of this, but, or if you were a bystander, you could say, I noticed that you asked to touch so-and-so's hair. I used to do that too, but I've since learned that it makes people feel exoticized. So talking about pets, we're going to talk about pet to threat when we talk about creating equity in our groups and our environments in STEM. So Keisha created this, Keisha Thomas in 2010, she coined this phrase, and then they went on to write an academic paper about it. So what this is Black women, that's really what they were talking about, and I'm going to extend it to other BBIPOCs, are often recruited and lauded, and then when they get there, they're infantilized, patronized, and condescended to, and then disrespected and discredited. And I have this happen to me all the time. People somehow think they know better about me or my work or whatever it is than I somehow know, even though I have a doctorate. When people resist their status as pets, they find that others begin to view them as a threat. They target them with microaggressions and or punishment for challenging the status quo. So this organization created a little diagram, which I think perfectly captures this. So a woman of color enters the organization, and there's that honeymoon period. You feel welcomed and needed and happy. And then reality sets in, and you begin to get injured because people are saying and doing things. And you try to work within, and you push for accountability. And the organization responds by denying or ignoring or blaming. Or they say, you know what? You've pointed out some good things. You fix it. And they make that part of your job responsibility. And sometimes if there are multiple people of color, they get pitted against each other. And ultimately, the way this ends is retaliation. The organization decides that the woman of color is a problem and targets her. They label it as a communication problem, a personnel issue, not a good fit. So I put this here because I want to invite you to think about how you might therapeutically respond with all of what we've talked about to the efforts of your institution, your organization, your group, diversifying, and how you can keep a woman of color or a person of color from being treated like this. So the last part of that liberatory consciousness was allyship and accountability. So remember I said I was going to share some of the content from some of the social media sites. So this is one. Has your allyship changed since this summer? So George Floyd was killed last May 25th. So what happened after that? 14 million people posted a Black square for Blackout Tuesday in June. Online conversations have since moved on, but Black people are still being killed. So I ask again, has your allyship changed since this summer? Thinking about allies, I put this title as Allies or Allied because I love this quote from Sonia Renee Taylor. I don't want an ally because an ally means you came here to help me. How are you helping me solve the problem you caused? Why aren't I helping you solve the problem you caused? Why am I not the ally and you the actor? Why is Blackness the responsibility holder and whiteness gets to be the helper? And so I want to share with you this relationship window because I think it's a great tool for when we're doing anti-racist and restorative work and we're thinking about allyship. We don't want to do things to people. We certainly don't want to not do things and ignore people. And we don't want to do things for people because we're in this together. So again, white supremacy, racism, oppression is killing all of us. So we are doing this with each other. And if we can hold the with as in the forefront of our mind when we're doing anything, there's a very good chance we're not going to cause harm. So with is about restoration. I have high expectations and I offer high levels of support. So instead of saying, if someone says someone's committed a microaggression or done something harmful, instead of saying, well, they're a good person, that doesn't have anything to do with it. I have high expectations for you. So you are a good person and I expect you to do better. And I'm going to offer you the support and the critique to help you get there. So one of the Ferguson activists, Kayla Reed, posted this to Twitter in 2016, and I've loved it. And I give it to people because I think it's a great way to remember how to be an ally. Always center the impacted. Listen and learn from those who live in the oppression. Leverage your privilege and yield the floor. I want to share these tools. So this is a snapshot, but I want to say that Dr. Sue and colleagues have created a great model for disarming racial microaggressions, and they have it from the micro to the macro level. So it's fantastic, and I would suggest that you look it up. He also has a white paper on facilitating difficult race discussions, 5 ineffective strategies and 5 successful strategies. So at this point, I would like to say thank you again for you all having me, for your attention, and I would love to entertain any questions or comments or suggestions. And regardless of how we end here today, if you have questions or comments or suggestions, I want you to feel free to email me at aziza@azizabp.com.
My, my, Aziza, you are wearing me out. I have to say it. Um, there's a lot here. There's a lot here. And I want to first say thank you. First and foremost, thank you. And now we're going to get to this Q&A. But as a personal thing, I have to say you were wearing me out during this talk. Um, so thank you. This will be on YouTube for others to watch and rewatch. And you also present a lot of resources. And I know you feel that it's important to present people with resources.
I
And
do.
and you move through some of them a little bit quickly. Um, but one that stood out to me that I'll just start the question, but then I'll get to those from the audience. And audience members, please submit more questions to both the Facebook and the YouTube and those that are on Zoom as well. When you got to the point about speaking about Latino women, and
Mhm.
you said, isn't it a stereotype because it's true?
Yes.
Um, I think there are people who don't get that said to their face, although through other actions they might feel that.
Mhm.
I'm just curious if you could expand on that a bit. And again, across cultures, of when people hear that response, how they manage their own psychological response to that, and then what, if any, action they could then take to the person saying that to them, how you would
So
address that.
that's a good point. You may not hear this if you happen to be a person of a Latina woman. It may not be said to you, but it's said to somebody. And so this is where the bystanders come in, right? It is your job, if you are in rooms that other people are not, to leverage your privilege. And so there are tons of ways that you can say, so I call it a calling in. And I say to people sometimes, like, I, I don't think that you meant to say, do you hear that you're saying, or I know that you're smarter than that. That's one of my favorites. I say to people, I know you're smarter than to believe that stereotypical X, Y, and Z about such and such. Because what I'm saying to you is, I'm calling you to your highest self. Um, Again, it always feels bad, it feels icky, but what we want, which is reconciliation and real conversation, is on the other side of that ickiness. So we're going to have to wade through it a little bit. And that means you don't let it go, because every time you let it go, you've co-signed it. And so, and the other thing is, don't come back to me and tell me somebody said it, but you didn't stand up for me when they said it. So, and in terms of, if you happen to hear it, or if you got some feeling about that and you were the person who was targeted, or you were sort of a collateral on that, one of the best things you can do, it's also really hard to do, is to respond. If you can gather yourself in the moment to respond, then you should. Because usually that helps people feel better. When you don't respond, you constantly play that back. You're playing out the scenarios of how you should have responded, and it eats at you. I remember interviewing a woman who told me about a microaggression that happened to her 30 years before, and how periodically it comes up and she thinks she's hurt all over again, and she just wishes she could go back in that moment and had the words to respond. So if you can in the moment, do. If you can't, and it's somebody you're going to come in contact with again, always follow up and say, a week ago you said X, Y, and Z, and I've sat with that and I feel X, Y, and Z about it.
Yeah, that's good. So questions from the audience now. Can you talk more about how to create meaningful intergroup contact? Is there a success story you can share?
Sure. So this happens, I don't want to say all the time. I didn't have that many success stories in my research, but what you do is like when I showed you that triage, what you want to do is stop what's happening. You don't want to bypass it. And you want to say to people, this might feel a little bad. It might feel a little icky. This might be a little scary, but we're going to do this together. And so come, let's all have a seat. Why don't you talk about one of the things you can do, especially with microaggressions, is you want to get to the meta of communication. I want you to say out loud what it is you meant. Because maybe when you hear yourself say it or you have to put it into words, you'll understand the harm before anybody even needs to tell you. But all the time, we facilitate, like we sometimes do in couples counseling. Okay, I want you to mirror, say what you said. Now, do you hear what you're saying? Can you validate what this person is saying? And so the one thing that people have to do, one of the things we have to do is we in psychology think of this window of affective tolerance, right? So, you can tolerate this much, but you have to learn to expand your window so that you don't have such thin skin when people give you critiques about, hey, I don't know if you realize it, but that thing you said or did was harmful. You have to
Right.
be able to hear that and to sit with that and then focus on, okay, now what should we do? And transformative justice says, okay, I acknowledge that harm. Now, what can I do to restore you and our relationship? And how do we go forward? And then how do we prevent this from happening again?
Yeah, I really think the audience will have to really dig into these resources you provided because they really cover a lot. Um, I guess it gets to another question here is that elite STEM institutions they lament about they can't find enough Black student candidates, and you spoke about this. Those of us know plenty, especially those of the HBCUs. I'm repping Spelman. I went to Morehouse. Today is Dr. King's actual birthday, Morehouse alum. But they have these requisite math, physics, and chemistry skills in high school to compete in their programs. Are they just using the wrong evaluation criteria? And are there other things that institutions can do to expand the pool? What are your suggestions?
So I say this to group therapists all the time. We'll start with expanding the pool. If you always go to the same networks, if you always go to the same well, you're going to always get the same water. And so you can't, most of us, if we look at our Facebook, a lot of the people or LinkedIn, the people we're connected to look a lot like us. You have to go outside of your own comfort zone, outside of your own normal network in order to find people. And then, of course, don't invite me into your burning house, right? So I need you to be doing the work, not just to find me to check something off, but to find me because when we are more diverse, there is so much research that shows diverse teams are more creative, more innovative, more satisfied. They have more problems that they solve. They have better outcomes. We see that with the COVID-19 vaccine. So I want you to find me because this is what's best for all of us, not what's best for your publicity campaign. And then I want you to do what it takes to make sure I can be safe on campus or in this institution. So again, don't invite me into a burning house.
Again, you're wearing me out, but this not for your publicity campaign. That resonates. Sorry. Another question. Again, you've been getting a lot of compliments. Great talk. People love the examples you're giving about multiple race perspectives and how those examples are so real. And I too would concur with that. And those therapeutic response examples, great framework, and make it so sense compared to other responses. But I wanted to ask from this questioner, what can I do as an Asian woman about what happened to George Floyd? But maybe that seems to not be the correct question to ask. But I can only say thank you and that I'm with you. So it gets to be this thing about people who are not there. What can they do to help? They're not in positions of power. They're not at these places of government, but they have been impacted. What would you suggest?
So this is the thing, and I would say to her, I'm with you too, right? Because we're in this together.
Right.
And so it really is a couple of things. One of the things I heard from the people in my research who were Asian identified was that they always sort of felt like it was a black and white issue, and they were like double dutching in terms of like, can I get in here? Is it appropriate for me to intervene? It is always appropriate for you to intervene. The one thing I want to encourage you to do is don't overstep somebody. So whenever I see a microaggression or something like that, I'm going to say to the person who was targeted, hey, I saw what just happened and I want to say something, but I want to give you a chance first, right? So I'm going to always follow the community who is most impacted. So that's going back to that ally. I'm going to take your lead. And then once you've done that, I'm going to add my voice to it because it's not enough for you to just say it. There needs to be a cacophony of voices that say, this is wrong. We will not stand for this. So, as an Asian person, those links about the organizations showing up for racial justice, movement for Black lives, any of those things, you can spread that information around. You can participate in those trainings because they have fantastic resources. And again, we can create a culture shift from both directions. Some of this is going to be top down, but we cannot be waiting on the government or our institutions or our boards or anybody to save us because they won't. And so if we create enough noise at the grassroots level, then people start to respond. And at the very least, you create a culture shift. I can't say what you all may do down the hall, but I know once you get to this barrier here, we won't make those jokes. We won't be glib about racism and police brutality. We won't overtalk people of color or those sorts of things.
You know, my daddy always said people will disrespect you as long as you let them, and it seems like that's what you're getting to. But there's some concerns. But essentially, it's what we live in. Like we live in what we practice. Can equality really be taught?
Yes. Yes. Just as empathy can be taught. So the thing is, people grow up not having to ever share or not having to consider the context or the perspectives or the feelings of other people. And so that's why you can learn that. Once you see any of these trainings, once you take those classes, once you begin to understand things. I mean, if we look at just the fact that you saw an 8 minute and 47-second or 46-second video, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of you are here because you saw that video. So that's the answer to your question. You clearly have a mind shift and you now, but you know that was wrong and you believe something needs to change. So
Oh,
it
that's
can be
interesting.
taught.
So that gets to another question. I'm gonna couple three, but first I got to that you directly lead into this question. Why does it take a tragedy for people to pay attention to the concerns and complaints about racism or discrimination? As in the case of Black employees who we're now hearing have complained about racism for years at
Right.
the Capitol and Wall Street system. Why is the tragedy necessary?
So unfortunately, our brains are a lot of things. We get overwhelmed easily. There's a lot of stimulus, there's a lot going on. There's so many things competing for our resources. And so that's why it's important that you do things to keep racial justice and anti-racism at the front of your perspective and you integrate it into your daily life. I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but it's important to talk about in social psychology. We talk about diffusion of responsibility and bystander intervention, right? So the more people that are present for something, the less likely any one person's going to intervene because
Mhm.
everybody thinks somebody else is going to do it, or they're not
Yeah.
sure if somebody else is going to do it, or they're all standing around confused about what to do. So that's one part of it. The other thing is we have to call people out. We've learned this that with bystander intervention, say I was hurt and I wanted help, and there were people walking past me on the street. I wouldn't just yell out help. I would say, you in the yellow shirt, help me, right?
Right.
Because you have to make it a very personal and direct thing. So some of you are here because you've chosen to make it personal and direct. And some of the things we have to do in STEM and in our organizations is we have to say to specific people, hey, I want you to help us with this campaign. I want you to use your power and privilege for us to move this thing forward.
Wow. I mean, so that gets to another thing that you spoke about, which was the calling people in versus calling people out. So there's a few questions I'm going to just ask you here. The question is, do you feel there are times when one versus the other is more effective? And then also, how does that play when I saw a professor being racist in class? How do I address that? I've had microaggressions in the workplace. How do I address that? And how does that all play together with this calling people in versus calling people out concept?
So I'm going to always trust your judgment on what the situation is. You know the culture of where you are. You also know what you're willing to lose and what you have at stake. But I would say that in general, I opt. Let me say this. There are some things that people can say that I mean, there are some people you could have run into at the Capitol last week, and there is no calling them in, right? So I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt unless there's reason not to. And I'm going to say, hey, that thing you said just landed real funny with me. It feels like you're saying X, Y, and Z. And again, so this is what we want to do. I want to get to the meta communication. What were you trying to say, or what were you trying to do? And then if it is indeed what it seems like, then I can try and correct you. Or that tool I showed you all the little snippet of from Dr. Sue, they talk about how you document, you report, and how you move things up the chain, right? So you want to do what you have to do to create a culture shift and to get some sort of restitution and justice. But I think that you also have to learn to disengage. There are times when people, it's not misinformation, it's not, a miscommunication, it's malintention. And when it's that, then I think you have to move on.
I can't, you keep wearing me out. So I'm gonna get to my. So, for example, in speaking of malintentions, there are those of us who are in this space, confident in our HBCU training and the rest of powerful around Black people, but we work jobs in other spaces. And so, one of our questions said, "My organization is going through an anti-racism campaign, as many of our workspaces are since the murder of George Floyd. But this question says, but I can't get around to participating with them because I don't think I'm ready to know just how ignorant my coworkers are. This would be highly triggering. Should I just get over it to help some of them out?
No.
Or should I continue to protect myself and them from me?"
Here's what we need to do. So there are a number of models, like Ken Hardy published a book in 2016, and he separates the task of the subjugated versus the task of the privileged. So one of the things that needs to happen, everybody's responsible for their own learning. You are not responsible for educating anybody. You can do it if you want to, but you certainly don't have to take that on. Sometimes, depending on the culture of your institution, depending on how regressive or how racist it is, you might need to do separate groups for a while. So they have like white learning caucuses, and then they have caucuses for the different groups of color. So that way, white people can sit with white people and learn some of these things that they don't know before we bring the groups together. So I would say if your organization is doing anti-racism work, but they haven't brought somebody in who can help you all do this in a way that feels safe and therapeutic and works through, then that's going to be a problem. And it does cause more harm. And then we end up throwing up our hands because we don't want to deal with it anymore. And we sort of abandon it. And so there are safe ways to do it. But again, we're not going to bubble wrap it. I promise you, and I always say this to people when I'm working with you, it's going to feel icky. The promise that I make to you is I'm going to stay with you in it, and we're going to work through it together. The more we work through it, the more we build up that muscle for having these productive cross-cultural dialogues.
So this whole concept of I'm going to work with you through it, again, gets back to you made several conversations, several points about allyship. And one of our questions says you really opened their eyes in your discussion of allyship and the inherent meaning when the term is used, and then you kind of redefined it, right? But I think we've seen a few questions come through about what is a good response when someone says they are or want to be an ally to be BIPOC, but they're not that. What is the appropriate response there? Because I think there's a number of questions about people saying there have been moments when they wanted to step in, but they felt like the response maybe was inappropriate. How would you counsel those?
So this is somebody who's not BIPOC, but they want to be a good ally. Right.
They're not. They're not Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, but they want to help.
I would say try and give yourself, and I don't want you to wait until you know all the things, right?
Oh, and I want one more piece to this for you to add to. Also, if the person who is impacted by the insult, who is a Black or Indigenous person of color, says, I'm moving on. But there is the ally who says, wait, I'm going to step in. What's your counsel?
So again, I'm always going to defer to the person, right? So I'm not going to jump over you. And if you say you're moving on and you can't deal with it, no, I'm going to go do it. But what I will address is there's something here in the culture that allowed that to happen. So I won't necessarily speak for you, but I will say as a person who was party to or privy to it, that wasn't right. And that can't happen again. And we need to make some changes so that that doesn't happen again. You are welcome to, you can still provide support for people. Sometimes people don't want to push the issue, but you can be an ally in the sense of, I'm here. If there's anything I can do around here, if you need me to listen out, if you need me to advocate, you tell me and I will use my privilege in that way. So you can offer your privilege to people. Again, when they're not in spaces where they can't be or they've been excluded, and you hear things or people say things, don't let that stand. Speak up and say, nope, such and such, so and so, these are the facts. And I don't think we should speak about that person when they're not here or like that or whatever it might be.
Well, how would you address it differently if there's a person who feels as though they were an ally? So we have one question that says, I'm a middle-aged white guy, right? A few times I've supervised a Black colleague, and once I counseled before attendance, and the response was, "You don't like me because I'm Black." And at first it felt like, oh wow, they played the race card on me. I am in support. I was raised that racism is wrong. What is a good response to something like that when there's let's say there's a professional counseling of this is an issue on your job, but it is taken the wrong way, or perceived to be taken the wrong way. How would a person deal with that?
Well,
That's a
one,
tough one.
let's, we always want to be thankful that somebody even trusted us enough to give us that critique. And then you need to sit with that critique and figure out what's coming up for you. Am I feeling
Can you expand
defensive?
on sit with that critique? Can you just really
Right.
give us
So
some
not
flesh?
push back on it, not say no, you're wrong. Don't give somebody they call it credentialing. When you start listing off, I have all these Black friends, and I once dated a Black person, and you start giving people all these reasons why you're not somehow the thing that they've said you might be, right? So don't do that. Just say, okay, I've heard what you said. I'm gonna give that some thought, and if it's okay, I'd like to revisit it. And then to do that internal work. Am I feeling defensive? Am I feeling ashamed? I need to really interact with what it is they've said to me, right? Because again, your opinion or your belief in yourself is good, even if you were well intentioned, might not have landed that way. And so this is a moment for you to figure out how you're landing. Something is getting lost in translation, and that person can be an ally for you in figuring out what's getting lost. So then
I
when you're
love.
calmer, you can go back and say, okay, I thought about it and I want to understand this a little more if you're willing to engage, because we always want people's permission to engage. Can you tell me a little bit more about what made you feel like, I don't know, I didn't like you, or I didn't believe in you, or I didn't respect you, or I was patronizing, or whatever it might have been, right? Because that's good information for you, not just for that person, but with anybody else you're interacting with.
I love that double feedback for the allyship about one can support the other. Um, so we've been saying a lot BIPOC, and we've been spelling it out and the rest. And that's really a term that's been starting to be used more compared to URM. I'm not the biggest fan of BIPOC for a couple of reasons, but can you distinguish the use of the two terms, and then for the audience even explain the switch that scholars are making with this terminology? And because I saw your head nod, I'm curious how you feel about the terminology switch, because
Okay,
you're
so
bobbing your head over there.
yeah, I use it, and I wanted to say, and I should have had a slide in there to define it, that there are limitations. So we use this because sometimes we need to be talking about how communities, like a global impact on communities of color. So Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color. So BIPOC is what it is, BIPOC, but it's recently been expanded to BBIPOC, right? Because sometimes brown people felt like their issues were getting lost, right? So there is utility sometimes in that global description. I want to capture the umbrella. The problem is, for me anyway, that term then centers whiteness because you're either white or BIPOC. And so the BIPOC is like everything that's not white. And so what's important is if you're talking about a particular community, if you're talking about Black people, say Black people. If you're talking about brown people, say brown people. If you're talking about Asian people, say Asian people. If you're talking about indigenous people, say indigenous people. If for some reason you're talking about a collective experience, then you can use those terms, but you should use them with that caveat. And if you're talking to people who don't know why you're using them, explain them. And if you ever see a term, because terms change a lot. I mean, 2 weeks ago, I didn't know it was BBIPOC, right? And so here we are. But what do? I adjust because it doesn't hurt me in any way, shape, or form to make sure that I am as inclusive as possible in my language.
I love that you say you adjust, and the term is changing. I mean, when we were in teen years, it was Afro American, then African American, and then the rest and the rest and the rest. And it's interesting, as BIPOC came out, I was like, wait, bi, is that in the LGBTQIA plus range? And it does get to be a mix. And then I also know Black people who don't like the term people of color. So it goes
Right.
back to what you said about talk about the community you're talking about if there is a defined community. If you are talking about several communities, then find the right term.
Right.
And so I get this back to the people who say, okay, so we're living in this world as it is currently. And the question is, how do we change campus culture that is predominantly led by white people to help recognize and to heal from these microaggressions when you're the minority? How does that work?
So this has to be, again, these are systemic issues and we can do a lot of individuals, but your organization, your institution is also going to have to decide, especially when this executive order expires. We're going to teach critical race theory. We're going
Mm.
to come in and have a sense of how do we generally interact with each other? What isn't tolerated on this campus? And so we have to teach people these things that we have not been learning. If you've come from some secluded environment where people all look like you and all that you got of a particular culture was from TV or from music, you're going to come in with some misconceptions. And so teaching people how to challenge their own cognitive biases and their logical fallacies and whatever their stereotypes are. And like one of the things we learned from Alport, who did a lot of work on prejudice, is meaningful intergroup contact happens when you give people a task that it requires all of them to do. And so it is putting them together, and then they're working together for a greater purpose. And they begin to find each other's strengths and to see people differently than they would have. Now, again, I'm not going to pretend like there's always.
But that assumes people can speak up on their job and that they have power positions. I mean, there's a few questions that have come up about what if you have to speak up to a superior when a comment is made regarding an assumption about one's ethnicity or any other dimension of diversity, and you're in the marginalized group. So that if that person is not keen on engaging and having these conversations that you're speaking about, what should that person consider, or what are their actions?
So I think that you should try to talk to that person, because we always do want to start with them. And then at least you'll see in that disarming microaggressions, Dr. Sue, they talk about documenting. I had this conversation with this person at this time. If there are other people who you can talk to say, how do I get through to this person about this or whatever, then certainly by all means do it. Sometimes a anonymous public shaming can be helpful.
Oh wait, you got to give us details.
Well,
Anonymous but public. What are the details there?
so, like when I was talking about how I've experienced being patronized or infantilized as a Black woman, even though I think I'm a pretty capable person, right? Um, and so it is sometimes you have to say to people, like you could just say in a meeting, it's really been uncomfortable with so and so, with this term being used around here, right? And then so at this point, I'm not saying your name, but I'm bringing it out to the public. And so hopefully other people would say, yeah, I have noticed that. And I don't think that that's right. Oh, that term is not right. We shouldn't be using that. So now it's out there. So that's one way you can do it. And again, it's anonymous and it's public shaming. And that is a calling out of sorts.
So, okay, we wind down on time. I have two more questions I really want to get at you for. Um, the first one I'm sure you've thought about before, but it seems like you answered the previous question with "I'm here if you need me," but it puts the onus on the BIPOC or the Black or Indigenous person, Black, Brown, BBIPIC person of color to tell us what's needed. Is there any way to be supportive without making that BBPIOC have to do the work? Right? Of course, always wanting to respect differences of individuality, and there is a level of exhaustion of always telling allies what you might need.
Yeah. So this is where the learning comes in. Now, and again, I gave you a lot of resources for you to go at it the way that feels most doable for you. Again, you have to learn. You aren't going to, like when I give those examples of all the context, you aren't going to know all of that or be able to even have a framework for that without you learning the history and culture and oppressions. And so once you know in this country, oh, this is what the history of policing is. If you see a new professor you've never met before on campus that happens to be Black, then maybe you don't reach for your phone to call campus security or whomever else, right? That might seem like you might think, oh, of course you wouldn't do that. But some people, that is their reaction. But when you understand the history of policing towards communities of color, it shifts for you, hopefully. So you have to learn some of this work. You're going to have to take yourself to some of these trainings or find a way to understand the history of oppression and supremacy in this country. And when you have that framework, then at that point, you don't have to ask anybody anything. If you know that the way we're hiring here is there's a disparity, you can tear that down without talking to anybody. You can bring that up and say, I noticed that we only recruit X, Y, and Z. I noticed that whenever there is a candidate of color, we have these extra criteria, whatever that is. No one has to give you permission for that.
Listen, again, you're where we at. I'm going to do a personal point of privilege as the moderator before we get our final question. but I'm gonna ask my own question. This didn't come up yet. I'm really, Imani Perry, and I talk about this in some talks that I give, wrote this piece talking about racism is terrible, blackness is not. And you mentioned during your conversation about assessing our own culture and the space of self-hatred and shame. That didn't come up in any of the Q&A, but I'd love it if you just give a little bit more flesh to that before we get to our final closeout question, which is also quite powerful. Like, anything you have to say about that self-hatred, shame, and explaining that to other communities.
So whenever we are, again, this came from multicultural psychology, as we're developing as people, like as we're growing up, right, we're inundated from the media and all sorts of messages that we get about who we are and what is the thing to aspire to and what must not be, right? And so it doesn't matter who you are, you're exposed to it. So that brings a lot of, if we live in we're steeped in supremacy, then that means that somebody is inferior. And so that automatically brings shame, and you want to assimilate and you try and look like or be like or talk like or do other people. And what we want to do is move ourselves through that. And hopefully, if you have the right support around you, that's what's happening as you're an adolescent, right? But it may not. And maybe you're an adult moving through those stages and those steps. Move to the place of like, I love me and the community I'm a part of, and I don't have any problems with other communities, and I support them, and we're in solidarity, right? So it is one of those things of, sometimes people say, and again, I understand that they're well-meaning, but they're like, oh, it must be so hard to be Black. No, it's great to be Black. Being Black is easy. I love this. What I don't love is having to deal with the oppression because I'm Black. And so that's why it's important for us to stop conflating whatever community of color or oppressed community with, the hardness, the difficulty. Race is not the problem. Blackness is not the problem. Racism is the problem.
Thank you. I mean, we love being Black. I have a shirt that says it. I should have worn it today, but I was repping Spelman on Dr. King's birthday, who's my Morehouse brother. And I'm going to close out with this question because this came up during the 2016 election, which was, the current president said, Black people, what do you have to lose? Mm-hmm. So you brought up this point for those in positions of power and privilege, talking with another person with privilege. Can you talk a little bit more about this concept in the slide that you bring that ended with asking the question, if someone says, I have privilege and I'm working for others, I'm a good ally, what have they lost being an ally? If you could just kind of seal that up for us in this final question.
So I think, again, if you noticed on that racism scale, when I talked about the allyship from Kayla Reed yielding the floor, the truth is, in order for us to dismantle this system, our bodies are already on the line as Black people. So you're going to have to put your body on the line too. And I understand the front line may not be for everybody, but I am spent at the end of the day fighting racism. Yeah. If you're not spent at the end of the day fighting racism, then have you really done it? And so that really means put yourself on the line, speak up, say what needs to be said, push back, do the things that we've talked about here and that you'll learn as you get more training. Do them and do them relentlessly.
Listen, I've got to say this. I want to thank you for giving your talk today. I want to thank you for this Q&A. I think you've been the first psychologist in our series. And I think as a lot of us are thinking about mental health and how to process, I think you've really brought some new insights and ways that we all can think about it. And I'm sorry, I just got to thank you for being a badass Spelman woman. I just want to thank you for sharing with the Gladstone and the Amplified and Critical Conversations talk. And thank you to all the audience members for tuning in. It will be posted on YouTube. And there you have it. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me.